We have both public and private events here. Thanks for joining in person and online. My name is John Quinley. I'm a director at Fortify Rights, and I'll be moderating the panel today. We have some people online joining us, and we have some people in person. We have the opportunity today to learn from Dr. Ken MacLean. He's the author of Crimes in Archival Form, a book about human rights documentation and fact production. So we're really lucky that he's in Bangkok today in person. Dr. Ken MacLean, he's a professor at Clark University and a senior advisor to Fortify Rights. Also on the panel today, we have Esther J joining us online. She's on Zoom. She works for Burma War Crimes Investigations, which is a great civil society organization doing human rights documentation in active conflict zones around Myanmar. So she'll be speaking to us from Zoom. Next, we have Saijai, the founder of Myanmar Witness. She's based here in Bangkok. And we have Patrick, who's a senior advocacy specialist with Fortify Rights. To start us off today, if you have questions online, please post them in the comment box, and we'll have a Q&A after the event. To start, Dr. Ken is going to give us a brief presentation of his book, and then we'll kind of have a conversation, some small remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up for folks to ask questions. Dr. Ken, thanks so much for being here, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm even more delighted to be sitting here with my co-panelists and Esther online. I look forward to learning about your work and your position on these matters. I'm going to be very brief. I'm not going to try and sum up a rather long book in a very short amount of time because I want this to be an interactive discussion. But I do want to say or have a few opening remarks. And if you can go to the first slide, please. The book is based on about 2 decades of fact-finding research on Myanmar that I've done with different organizations and as an academic researcher. And it was really pulling together my thoughts on the work I've been directly part of and the work I've seen done by others. And it features a number of case studies, one by a human rights organization, Korean Human Rights Group, as some of you may know, law clinics, humanitarian organizations, and so on, to really look at how they directly and indirectly go about documenting human rights violations, primarily in Southeast Myanmar, which has been the historical focus of my work. And I don't make an overarching theoretical claim as so much as through a series of case study and comparisons, try and show why we need to take human rights fact-finding more seriously and more critically in a more self-reflexive fashion. In the interest of transparency, because I believe we can actually make our work stronger, better, and more impactful, if you will, by being more honest about the choices we make, the pros and cons of those choices, and the limitations are areas where we are not or should not feel comfortable making truth claims because they're not, in fact, based on sufficient empirical evidence. And so what do I mean by that? Well, very quickly, here is a generic slide from the group Witness that describes fact-finding. And what I want to emphasize is the very English words themselves makes it sound like facts are out there. You simply have to go out, collect them, throw them in a report, and then the world will change. And as all of you know, life is not so simple. Fact-finding is not so simple. It is a process, moreover, it is an iterative process, where at each point in this process, all kinds of decisions are made that have a tremendous impact on what questions are asked as part of your research design, what methodologies you use, how you go about gathering data broadly combined, how you analyze it, write about it, and then package it in different ways for different uses, advocacy being the primary one. And this is not really rocket science, as the expression goes. This is not earth-shattering news. But what I tried to show through the case studies is if you go about deconstructing the work these groups do, how much more complex the work actually is. What are the epistemological or knowledge implications of how do we know what we think we know? Methodologically, why the things we take for granted actually have an outsized impact on what we're able to find. And of course, legal and ethical questions that often arise in private conversations, but aren't actually taken up in a public, critical, and reflexive way. And that slide is just meant to get us thinking about that, because all too often, and here I include myself, we are in emergency response mode. We're responding to a crisis. We're trying to get information out as quickly as possible. Mistakes are made, but rarely admitted. And we move on and do the same thing again and again. And not enough groups, although Fortify Rights I know is trying to address this, pause and really say, what are we doing, why, how, and what are the consequences? So if you can go ahead, another slide. All right. So I'm borrowing here from the ideas of Jim Scott, a famous political scientist who recently passed. And he asked the questions, how do states see? How do they go about governing? And he made a very important 3-point argument that is actually about a process. They simplify diversity and complexity. They then, as we go about getting the plug back, make things legible, readable. How do people sitting in Bangkok know what is happening on the border regions with regard to Myanmar, for example? And then they create it in formats, often statistics, but not exclusively, that can be managed and used to affect change, i.e. policy. So one of the things I did with the book is that rather than seeing like a state, I said, seeing like a human rights fact finder. How do human rights groups, broadly defined, go about doing their work? And I'm going to pause here for a moment to see if we can resolve the technical difficulty. Well, I need the slides so people can understand. Oh, there we go. Very slide. If you can go to the next slide, please. All right. So what I asked, as I said a moment ago, how do fact finders, human rights fact finders, simplify? How do they narrow down and focus on particular violations? And what are the consequences when you end up decontextualizing the whole ecosystem of violations happening to focus narrowly on torture or gender-based violence or any other thing? How do you go about making clear what is happening in a chaotic conflict zone, like Esther does in Karenni State, making it intelligible to audiences that know little or nothing about the civil war in Myanmar and Karenni State in particular? And how is that information to be used? And of course, the answers vary depending on the organization and the conflict, hence the case study approach in my book to show you how varied these things are. So my attempt in each of the case studies is to open up the proverbial black box. What actually happens from the point of preparing the research and the actual production of the report of the advocacy campaign that is rarely talked about. And if you can take the next slide. Okay. So here are the case studies I've been mentioning. It's really about the control of different kinds of bodies. The first one that I'm going to say just a little bit more about so I can transition to the end of my comments and the discussion is verbatim. Verbatim is a fancy way of saying quotes. Human rights organizations use quotes endlessly. I pause and say, okay, how do you go about quoting testimony? And what are the consequences of quoting testimony in this way as opposed to that way? And what are the implications in terms of legal proceedings, fundraising, and other contexts? And I do a similar thing with citations, with narrativity, and so on. And I'm happy to say more after the event if you're interested. Next slide, please. So just a very quick taste. I have a chapter on forced labor, the great work done by Karen Human Rights Group on Karen State and the military's use of forced labor for decades. And so if we can jump ahead another slide, right? So the question is, with verbatim, with quotations of people's experiences with forced labor, specifically the actual forced labor documents the military issued to village headmen saying you need to organize X number of people to do certain kinds of work. How does Karen Human Rights Group come to be seen as an expert on this topic? What makes their claims credible? And of course, what value or use might they have in advocacy context, either with the International Labor Organization, as was the case for many decades, or now other UN bodies thinking about the use of people as human shields, human minesweepers, carrying ammunition in war zones, which is a violation, obviously, of international law. So if you can advance one more. All right. So what I did is I compared and contrasted the written orders that the military actually issued. Yes, indeed, I did read through all of those. My eyes were crossed by the end of it. And here the verbatim is, these are the actual notes written by or typed by military commanders. And then I compared and contrasted it with porter testimonies, civilians who were forced at gunpoint to carry food and ammunition and what have you for the military, who then escaped to Thailand and were interviewed by KHRG. And if you can move again, right? So what happens is if you sort of take quotations seriously and what they actually do, you can look at their visual layout and their stylistic formats, the kinds of translator notes that have to be used to explain cultural concepts that do not translate readily across languages. You can identify typologies and the problems with types because they obscure the process of how forced labor as a system works when you focus on different categories or types. And all this is to say, this matters. If you are genuinely concerned about how forced labor is organized, how it's perpetuated, how it's institutionalized, and you want to think about how to dismantle that system and not simply generate report after report of saying X number of people were forced to build a road or carry ammunition. If you're thinking long-term in terms of justice and accountability, you need to have that understanding. And that's what I try and point out. So lest I bore you too much with that description, I'm going to pause here and turn the mic over. Is it Esther who's speaking next, or John? Okay, sure. So I will pause here and let John go back to facilitating.
Thank you, Dr. Ken. That's really interesting and helpful, and I hope it lays a good foundation, I think, for the conversation that we're about to have with Saijai as an open source investigator, Esther, who's doing more long-form investigative interviews on the ground in Myanmar. So Esther, I think we'll go over to you first. I know that you as a journalist and you as a researcher for Burma war crimes investigations, you've been in active conflict zones for many years, been working as there's ongoing fighting. So how do you gather information and how do you gather facts in such a hostile and complex environment? And how do you share that with the rest of the world? Esther, you're allotted about three to 5 minutes. Thank you so much, and it's an honor to have you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. First of all, please forgive me if my English not good enough. Yeah, our group was founded last year. It's quite a new group, and then we based in Karenni, the conflict zone. Yeah, we have so many challenges and also some opportunities working on the ground. Like the most challenging things are like the security risks. We face a lot of security risks like the airstrike, the artillery fire, or also we have so many limitations for traveling because it is the conflict zones. Yeah, for us, yeah, it's it's easier for us to gather information because we are on the ground, not like calling from, not like other from the conflict from enzyme. Yeah, it's maybe it's quite easy. We just went to the place where the incident happened and just collecting uh, the information like video footage and interviewing or something like that, or all of the information. Yeah, we have that opportunity, but on the other hand, is challenging for us to maintain this data, because we also have we ourselves can protect from the risks we face. If something happened to us, yeah, I always worried about that. I think that what if I die or something, I injure or something happened to us, what about all my data? Or who will keep my data safe? That I used to worry. For us, we don't have so many human resources or uh, funding. To be honestly, we are running this group with the income we get from we working as freelance journalists. We don't have funding as our organization. That's why, yeah, we just keep our documents and data with like the traditional way in our hard disk or in our drive, something like that. Just, yeah, it's very challenging for us. But one of we also send our documents to the BIDBM, which is one of the, I think, the international organizations. But we can think that, yeah, we have our document for there, and it's quite safe. When we start our organization, we intend to give all our data for open source for all the human rights organizations and all the media outlets to use as an open source. But we couldn't, but we can do it as we think of like that, because for some document it is quite it's not safe for the interviewees, for the interviewee to make an open source. That's why we don't know how to handle with that. Yeah, if we have some more resources, yeah, we can maintain our data and document very more systematically. Yeah. That's what we face so many challenges and regarding to our documents and data. Yeah.
Much, Esther. It's always great learning from you. You have so much experience working really patiently in the war zones in Karenni and other places. So we really respect the work. Just for background, Fortify Rights and Burma War Crimes Investigations put out a report, I think earlier this year, right, Esther, on a wartime
March.
killing. Yeah, on a wartime killing that happened in Shadal, Karenni State. And that was a very complicated investigation. We were not 100% sure who the perpetrator of the violation was. Was it the ethnic resistance organization or was it the Myanmar military? So in the end, we were quite open about the challenges around that investigation, and we called on the NUG and we called on the Interim and Executive Council in Karenni State to further investigate the killings. We felt as a human rights organization, we couldn't make a really big claim to say we know exactly who killed them. It was very confusing, I think. It was a wartime killing. There was a lot happening, active fighting happening. And Esther and your team did an amazing work documenting that incident. Yeah, just to explain some background.
Yeah, I want to say that in that case, if it is the women and children were killed during the fighting, and I think at the time, if uh, there was a doctor also in shadow, and if they can work in coordination and they can examine the body, the dead body properly. I think we can have more evidence that who committed, who killed the civilians. Yeah. Uh, After we went there, it's very difficult for us because it's not easy to dig to, to dig the bodies and to find the body which already buried. Yeah.
That's really interesting work, and thank you for the work you're doing. So Esther is and her organization is really an expert in that fact-finding process in the hostile environments, and we're really lucky to have Saijai with us today, and her organization is really committed to open source investigations, which brings up its own challenges and opportunities in Myanmar. And Dr. Ken's book actually has a section on more open source technologies used in human rights investigations. So Saijai, I wonder if you talk a little bit about the work that you do in Myanmar, open source work, and the challenges that you're facing gathering information in such a closed context.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I know Bangkok is hot and you taking time to ride motorbike or whatever to get here. And thank you to Ford for organizing this important conversation. It's such a pleasure, Esther, to hear you and listen to your story, because I felt like the work we do at Open Source Investigation, we cannot do what we do without people like Esther, who collecting information on the ground. So I just want to start with how we start Myanmar Witness. So Myanmar Witness start with the group of people who, after the coup happened in Myanmar, we felt powerless about what's happened, because a lot of us has to leave the country, pack our bag last minute and left everything behind and be in other country. And we still care deeply about Myanmar, but there's no way for us, journalists or human rights defenders who talk about and reporting about things that happen in Myanmar. So that's why that we turn into other tools. So we turn into social media as a way to tell the story about what's happening. I felt like the word open source could create some kind of like really special tool and technique, but actually it's really basic. Basically, what open source investigation is finding information that available online, right? This information could be from Twitter posts, Facebook posts, somebody sharing images or video. This is basically what we do, trying to find information that available online and tell the story about it. And I just want to emphasize that before talking about opportunity and challenge, people often look at the final product of like really complicated story or report, but actually this is possible because people like Esther, who are doing the work on the ground. It's possible because journalists collecting data. It's possible because people sharing and taking photo in their community and sending it to us. So I don't think you can look at open source investigation in isolation as a product at the end, but it's actually the whole pipeline, starting from Esther and people like her who's sharing the story. If you talk about the opportunities, first, I think as I shared, the reason we start this is for us to tell the story of what's happening, right? So the opportunity is allow the people from the community to share what they see, what they hear, and creating the story and sharing with the world. So I think that first, that is the opportunity. Second, is also allow people who is not there to be able to help and investigate and find the fact what is happening without being there. And the third opportunity is also about safety, because whether you want it or not, Myanmar story is telling through the third eyes. Because a lot of people, a lot of journalists cannot go there anymore. So a lot of people who reporting about Myanmar, the major news that you read about Myanmar is come from outside, or people who are not inside the country. So I think that's are the three opportunities, but also with opportunities come with challenges. We can discuss more, but the 4 challenges that I would like to point out. First, at the same time, we're talking about is empower people to tell the story. But the challenge could also be is take away the power from the people. Giving example, a lot of incidents that are happening in Myanmar or even in Gaza, when journalists wanted to report about it in the past, they could listen to people's story and the people can tell what's happening and they report on it. But right now with open source information or that, they have to wait to be verified. And when it means by verify that somebody sitting in New York, looking at satellite data and verify whether this is happening or not, geolocate the location. So first, it's also take away the narrative and the power of the people, which is kind of like conflicting about the origin of it, why this is important. Second is also about privacy. Information that share and people share with images and video share many times, it could also reveal the privacy of the people who create that data, and it could also put them at risk, right? The people who send the data, they might not intend to be shared online, but that information could be shared online. So the privacy is also the issue. The third area is the bias, especially in case of Myanmar, because there's some area where there's no internet. So we can only access to the information and data from the area that have internet access. And also when we focus on open source, we can only report information that we can verify, right? So it could be biased. There's some incident that happening, but we don't have the capacity to verify. So that information go under report. And the last one, which is very important challenge, is mental health. It's the mental health issue of the people who have to look at this data day and night. My colleagues who their job is to look into this information, and that could also pose a lot of trauma and mental health issue for the team.
Thank you, Saijai. Interesting. Myanmar Witness also has some good toolkits on mental health and looking at kind of graphic or horrific content and how to kind of put mental health armor on before you go and view quite graphic or graphic content related to atrocities. And so I know Myanmar Witness over the last few years has put out some toolkits on that that's been really helpful. I think finally we have, before we open it up for Q&A and online, I think we wanted to give Patrick an opportunity. Patrick works for Fortify Rights as an advocacy specialist. He was just in Geneva, I think last week, right? And just trying to build the link between human rights research and how you use that research to actually do advocacy that can change problematic laws, policies, and practices in real time. So Patrick, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, and as John said, I did just get back from Geneva at the weekend, so excuse me if my thoughts that I penned during that flight are a little bit muddled, but hopefully we can clarify them during the Q&A. I mean, first off, thanks for everyone joining us today in person and in line, and thank you, Ken, for a really significant piece of work. I'm the Senior Advocacy Specialist at Fortify Rights, so my job isn't so much on the documentation side, but what we do with that documentation and how we use it to, as John said, change problematic laws, policies, and practices. So my day-to-day it looks a lot like a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, a lot of talking, a lot of writing as well, using the information that we've collected on the ground and through working with partners in Myanmar and other places that we work, to use that information to build a convincing case. And it's interesting because I looked up the word advocacy and its root, and it actually comes from the French avocat, which is originally referred to a lawyer. So the link between documenting crimes and building a strong case and putting that before a court, whether it's an actual court or court of public opinion, or presenting it to states, I think the connection there is quite clear. I think one thing I'd like to mention before I move on to the elements of modern advocacy is that credibility is really the core of everything always the kind of the foundation of everything that we do. If we lose credibility through doing poor quality investigations or poor quality advocacy or poor quality other work, then we really don't have a leg to stand on in human rights. And so again, documentation in particular is very key to that. I'd say that modern human rights advocacy is a mixture of three different things: law, politics, and communications. And I'll look at each of these in turn and try and explore some of the linkages with documentation. So in terms of the law, we at Fortify Rights anyways really use that as a guide for our investigations, even down to the very questions that we ask during our interviews. We look at the elements of human rights violations and we try and work through those elements to make sure that what we are documenting is in fact a human rights violation. And that makes our work hopefully more authoritative, and it also opens new avenues for advocacy, such as making submissions to courts or making submissions to national human rights institutions or working through international accountability mechanisms like the ICC. And the classic way of thinking about law and human rights documentation is that you apply the facts that you've gathered to the law, which is what we do most of the time, but we're also trying to do it the other way around, where we use documentation to encourage innovative and more progressive interpretations of international law. An example of this is our recent report on mental harm as an act of genocide in the Rohingya genocide. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that and see some of the innovative ways we've applied our documentation. As you can imagine, we have a more challenging relationship with politics. We all enjoy looking at international laws and understanding treaties and things like that. But when it comes to politics and politicians, especially in the post-truth era, it's an arena that can be really quite tricky for us to navigate, but it's really important for us to engage with, because as the saying goes, politics is the art of the possible. And so if we want to get change going, we really need to engage with politics and politicians. And politics is about power, who has it and where it comes from. There are many sources of political power, whether it's democratic or constitutional or financial. As a human rights organization, often we are viewed as, by the public and others, as having moral authority. And that's very useful, and we make use of that, but it can also leave us susceptible to attack even, of being too idealistic, coming up with recommendations that are not practical. And so we do try and ground our recommendations and our findings in the reality and the socio-political circumstances that we're working within. We also have to contend with attacks on our documentation, particularly fake news, the attack that it's fake news, and political opponents putting down alternative facts or different interpretations of international law. A final element, as I said, of modern advocacy is communications. And I think that this probably is most linked in a way to the documentation, because it's about how we present those facts. And obviously that is a decision and a choice that we make. And it's an extremely important one. If our documentation isn't communicated effectively, we shouldn't have bothered doing it in the first place. But some challenges of modern communication that I've noticed that we have to contend with our communication is that we're competing for very limited attention spans. It's the TikTok generation, so you need to get your point across in less than 30 seconds, otherwise TLDR, people won't read it. And so that's really difficult, because we are trying to condense complex situations, complex human rights investigations into easily digestible communication products. And that leads to maybe sometimes oversimplification, and sometimes we can gloss over some of the nuance in the things that we've documented. Working with the media it can be challenging, but it's very, very important, and the media is such an important ally for us. But the way that the modern media works is also that they want sound bites essentially from human rights organizations. They don't want really to, there are some good journalists who do really want to engage in the details and things, but in the most part, they want a catchy quote that they can put into their piece, and they can tick it off their box that they've spoken to a human rights defender. So again, that can lead to oversimplification, I think. And then kind of related to that, there are often, especially with Myanmar, there are kind of predominant narratives, I think, that are used by journalists, maybe lazy journalists, and they kind of just keep on reinforcing these tropes. And so, part of our job when we are working with journalists is to try and challenge some of these predominant narratives and trying to, add complexity to the picture that they're presenting and different views. So I think I'll leave it there, but hopefully that's enlightened some of the linkages between documentation and modern advocacy.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, that's very helpful to talk through those different threads that go, I think, across advocacy and human rights. We're going to open it up to the Facebook Live. If you have questions, please post them in the comments. Also, we have some people here at the fort. If you have questions, please let us know. We had one question come through already from a Rohingya person from Rohingya Student Network, Dr. Ken. And he has a question. He had actually a number of questions, but one thing that we haven't touched on, which you do in your book, is around archival facts, archival information, and how do we as researchers use that work, and what do you see as the benefit of some of that archival stuff, information that you've sifted through over the years?
Thank you for a very easy question. Well, there's an important difference. There are obviously unintentional human rights archives, such as the kind generated by perpetrators who never expected to be held accountable for their actions. So the Nuremberg trials and the Nazi documentation convicted them, essentially. If you notice, there was almost not a single Holocaust survivor who testified. They simply looked at the records. The same thing was largely done with the surviving Khmer Rouge officials at the ECCC. That is often considered to be the gold standard, where the regime officials incriminate themselves. You also have unintentional archives where you have an organization doing one kind of work, like humanitarian work, like the White Helmets in Syria, who, through their own efforts, end up documenting a wide range of human rights violations that can, when recontextualized, be used for criminal accountability purposes, or certainly advocacy. It may never reach criminal proceedings. But you also have archives generated by human rights groups. And here I'll bring the conversation back to Esther. And she's describing the work by predominantly journalists who are collecting all kinds of information, social media, photographs, video clips, interviews, and trying to figure out several things simultaneously. What, if any, collection protocols should we use? Is there a consistent plan and best practice that all of the journalists part of her network are using? And if not, should there be one? The answer is probably yes, but maybe not in certain circumstances. How are you going to archive that information? That is, by what decisions will you choose that this bit of social media deserves to be preserved and that one does not? What are your protocols for preserving metadata? The time, the geolocation, verification, if possible, of the person that produced it and so on, because that is really critical in terms of provenance in the legal setting and chain of custody. That you can produce all kinds of facts, but without that kind of law-specific documentation, your reports may only be used for context. They will not be probative, a fancy word meaning evidence in the actual trial itself, because you did not do all those steps. How do you safeguard that archive to protect it from seizure by security officials, accidental destruction from flood, a hard drive that crashes? Where do you store this information? what security information do you use in terms of software, Signal, Telegram, what have you, but also where do you house this? Most of the Syria archive work is kept under the auspices of the UN. It's independent but protected from hacking because it was not safe to keep it in Germany where it was. So you have a whole host of decisions about how to organize the architecture of a human rights archive to make it safe, secure, but also usable. And this is being done, in this case, by Esther's collection of journalists who may have no official training in this. So the question can be, those of us who know how to work with social media, like Saijai, what kind of support, if possible, could they share with the Burma war crimes investigations so that they are better able to do this work? Not to give you extra work to do, you have plenty of your own, but my point being, there is a misfit or misalignment between those groups with this kind of expertise and resources and those human rights defenders on the ground doing the hard, dangerous work. And there needs to be a lot more cooperation, collaboration, capacity building, and mutual support, because without it, justice and accountability will remain very, very difficult, if not impossible. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Ken. That's helpful and adds. I think you have the archival work, you have the work that Esther's doing, you have the work that Saijai is doing, the open source. That's a lot of different areas to gather information. I'd like to open it up to anyone on Facebook Live or here in the audience if you have questions. I have one just coming through now. So I'll read it out loud. Thank you for the great presentations. I was wondering to what extent various speakers take future legal accessibility into account when gathering and reporting data. Do they feel this results in more accurate or possibly more biased reporting? And would Patrick expand on the progressive interpretation method in relation to the Rohingya report? Don't know who wants to take any of those.
Yeah, sure.
Patrick, do you want to take the last one?
I can take the last one. Also, I can speak a little bit about the first. I can speak a bit about the first half of that. Speak a bit about that first half of that question as well, maybe in our work. I think that we definitely take into account future legal proceedings, and it's a key element of our work on Myanmar in particular, obviously, because there is a prospect for future legal proceedings in various domains. There are ongoing legal proceedings, and so we have to take that into account when we are doing our documentation. Others on the team have more first-hand knowledge of that, but I know that one thing that we've done, for instance, is change our consent process to ensure that it aligns with the various international accountability mechanisms that are ongoing, and so we can readily share information to the IIMM and others because we've gathered that consent at the interview stage. In terms of the progressive, more progressive interpretations of international law, I think that, for instance, the report that I mentioned, the mental harm report, which you can grab a copy of here, I think, that was an interesting one because even though mental harm as an act of genocide was always conceived as part of the definition of genocide in the convention, there's never been any court that has looked into that element, and there hasn't really even been much human rights documentation based around that. So it really was a kind of undiscovered element of genocide law, and I think for that one, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think we did kind of a quantitative approach where we worked with human rights enumerators on the ground. We trained a team of Rohingya in the camps in Bangladesh to actually do a quantitative survey of the impact of the genocide on individuals' mental health, and therefore could kind of quantify the impact it had, and then look at it in terms of the law and see, you know, does it reach that level that is stipulated in the law of mental harm, which is, you know, designed to destroy in whole or part the Rohingya community. So I mean, that's one element, I suppose. I think what we're looking to try and do more of is, you know, work that expands people's understanding of human rights law as well, and expands on existing law into new domains. So for instance, the right to internet, for instance. I mean, I think Myanmar is a key example of this, where the military has consistently cut or throttled internet access since the coup. And that not only inhibits our work as human rights defenders, but it inhibits emergency services, it inhibits local traders, you know, people just trying to make a living. The internet is so key to modern existence that maybe there is an emerging right to the internet, and maybe there needs to be more work done on that. So it's just one area that we're looking into and thinking about as well.
I'm happy to add on this question. So I think what we do about documenting human rights abuse with the long-term goal, bringing justice and accountability, right? This is like a marathon, it's a long-term goal that we aim to this goal. However, the work that we do every day is also have a short-term and medium-term goal. So I just want to share that short-term and medium-term goal here because it's actually give us hope while waiting for this change to happen. So there are two examples that I would like to share. The first one that we did with a collaboration with Sister to Sister on gender-based violence in Myanmar on Telegram. So with that work, we actually collecting how Myanmar military harass women online systematically by using social media. And this is actually linked to what Patrick's saying about advocacy work, which I want to highlight that evidence is really important. So we actually scrape all the Telegram data, 1.6 million data, and verify that information and try to see which posts that actually violate Facebook content policy, and why, if it violates Facebook content policy, why it's still there, right? And this work actually lead to Facebook and Telegram remove a lot of channel that's harassing women. And it's actually changed to the way people think about using, like the social media actually look into this issue more. So it's actually lead to social media company thinking about changing their policy toward Myanmar. And I think the key takeaway from that advocacy work that I want to highlight, first is the importance of evidence collecting. Second, looking at when we want to use the data to create change, not looking at social media company as a black box. You know, it's not thinking about, they're actually human behind this. So looking into like who to talk to in the social media company in order to do advocacy work, who care about this issue, and try to find that person and start with that point of advocacy. And the third area is that the lesson learned, instead of looking at them as the opponents of like, okay, all social media company are bad, we're looking them at collaborator. We're going to them and saying that this is the evidence that we found, and we have the same goal of creating this space safe for women in Myanmar, and how could we work together on this? So I think that's the key takeaway relating to advocacy work when we're doing this work in the short term. The other example that I would like to share was a lot of report that we produce, we actually use in closed door advocacy. We're not just pointing out and putting it on the report for people to read the report. We're actually talking to a lot of ethnic groups and pointing this out about the intended impact of the fighting. For example, a lot of impact on school and hospital and children. And a lot of time from what we heard on the ground is that a lot of groups do not want it to have this intended impact, but they're not sure. And when they say that, they deny that this is not happening, it did not impact children in school. But by bringing this report that we produce, using like clear evidence and open source investigation and collecting all the data, creating in a systematic report and sharing it with a third party who could bring this up to this group, I think that is really critical and in bringing change behind the door.
Esther, do you have any comments on submitting to international accountability mechanisms, or the work that you've been doing submitting to the IIMM?
Yeah, as we are a group based on the ground that we just collecting the evidence. We go to the faced with an incident happen, and we send to the INTBN because they are they send this information to the court. Yeah, this is what we can do that. Yeah, it is like the information, as we are an independent group, we have is sometimes it's very difficult for us to have some access to travel to some areas. Yeah, we have some difficulties like that. We do as much as we can without any bias, because we are independent group. We have no time with any arms or political groups. Yeah, that's our informations are like is the third party information, or we can say, yeah.
Thank you, Esther. That's helpful. We have one more question, I think. Oh, yeah, Dr. Hen, do you want to talk about submitting to future accountability processes or using documentation for future accountability processes?
Sure. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second and use perhaps a well-known, well-documented incident. And that is during the 80s and 90s, Western feminists from the global North had, as part of their political project, going to West African countries. And to oversimplify it, teaching them, women's groups, about patriarchy and why what West African women really needed to do was tear down patriarchy and their lives would be so much better. And the West African feminist groups said, thank you very much, but no, the most important thing affecting our lives right now is capitalism, which affects both men and women and therefore gender relations because of its economic impacts. Yes, patriarchy matters, but it's not the most urgent problem. We have other agendas. And I mention that example because what do lawyers like? More law. That is the solution. More law, better law, more expansive law, more precise law. And that's not to make fun of lawyers. They do important work. My sister's one. But I will say, when you think about accountability and justice, it is much wider than simply the legal definition. That's not to say it doesn't matter, but to other people, their priority and how they define justice and accountability may have little or nothing to do with the law as we understand it through the context that refracted through the International Criminal Court. That's not to say you can't pursue that, but in our rush to focus on the law, it's easy to forget that the people most affected by the violence might have different priorities. And that's easy to let our own organizational mandate dictate what we research, how we research, and how we plan to use that research in a way that is actually a disservice to the people themselves. It is prioritizing our own organizational interests over those who you might call victims or survivors, depending on the context. And their needs and desires, aspirations need to be taken into account as well. Ideally, this would result in a multi-pronged approach, but all too often, due to specialization, donor priorities, and so on, it does not. So I just encourage us to not forget other people might want dramatically different things.
We have a question in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, your comment just triggered a further question on consent, which had already been in my mind after what Saijai said about pictures and how we use them. Because I think, like, how do you see us, or as people who try to document human rights organizations, I work for OHHR, sort of meaningfully ask for consent so that we ensure that there's not a picture that is taken by someone and then the 10th person who handles it does something with it, which is absolutely not in interest. First of all, from a point of view security, but then even broader, from a policy agenda. So how do you kind of conceive of a good way of asking for consent for the use of information? Could be pictures. That was my first thought, but maybe more broadly.
Well, I'm going to hand the microphone to Saijai in a moment because this is something she does every day. I will refer you to the Berkeley protocols, University of California protocols. They worked with a wide range of stakeholders, including many UN bodies, to try and come up with best practices. The short answer is the technology, as usual, is moving far more quickly than activists and certainly lawyers and politicians. So there is not a universal standard of what consent would look like. For me, it falls into the precautionary principle, and that is, unless you have explicit consent from the person in the photograph or the film, you should be very, very careful about using it, because security in the immediate term, obviously, but also long term, that if this stuff is submitted as part of a case file to the ICC, for example, it becomes open to the defense side to examine the evidence as part of developing its own case. So what someone may have felt safe sharing at one moment in time that they consented to in an informed way may no longer apply 10 years from now when the political context has changed dramatically. So there's a temporal dimension that most people don't even think about. So as an academic, I'm very good at raising questions and criticizing. That's what I get paid to do, and this is an example. So as I promised, I'm going to hand the microphone to Saijai and hear what policy, if any, you have, or how you're thinking as an organization of dealing with open source material and questions of informed consent.
Thank you for the question. There are 3 C's that I think about to answer your question. I think there is consent, context, and consult when thinking of this area. So as Dr. Ken said, consent is important to ask, obviously, but also it's important to think about the context in which after we got the consent, what are the context that this information might be used in the future, and also the consult with the third part, which is quite critical, because even though we get the consent from the people to share, oftentimes we consult with others as well, not just the person asking that what is the implication of sharing this in the future. Just give an example that a lot of time when people share images with Myanmar Witness, they often say that you can use this image and please feel free to use it anywhere. I have the consent to share this image. But a lot of time when we verify the images could actually come from their windows and then take a photo of this. But let's say I'm taking a photo of this house. It could tell, even though I give consent to share this photo, because I think that nobody could tell that it's come from me. But actually, if we investigate further, we can know that it's actually come from the fort that taking photo of that building. So it's actually traced back to the person who shared, and they might not aware of that. The reason when they said you can allow to share this because they thought it's actually not harming back to them, but actually, exactly, it's anonymous, but actually it's not. So a lot of time before we share any images in our policy, we have a privacy review in which before any content, even though we got the consent from the person to share, we do a thorough privacy review to make sure that it cannot trace back. So yeah, anyway, I think the 3 C that I think is helpful is consent, context, and consult. Hope that answered it.
Esther, do you want to talk about how you at Burma War Crimes Investigations think about the consent process and security?
Yeah, for the consent process, when we go to interview like the survivors or the family members of the victims. We ask consent for that, which for which we will use their testimony or we explain about that. And yeah, if even if they give us, they allow us to use their photos or their testimony, but we can we rethink, we consider again whether it will be it will harm them or not. Yeah, this is what we do. Yeah. If they some people they live in and are not in the military control area, but someday they can travel to the military control area, and if their photos appear in the public, this can let they can this can lead to the dangerous situation. That's why we consider their safety.
Thank you, Esther. Just a little bit on Fortify Rights' process too. Some of the research we put out, it's like a long-term conversation about consent. I did an investigation in 2019 on the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, and abductions related to ARSA. We actually did that research like a year and a half, I think, before we even published it. We had these long-term conversations with the family at the time about what they felt comfortable with, how they wanted us to use the information. So we did mostly private advocacy with the documentation for a year and a half. And then finally they said, you know, this isn't working. We want to do public advocacy. So that was more of a conversation. In other situations, unfortunately, you can't go back, as Esther is talking about, and have a follow-up conversation. It's just the consent right then and there. The internet's off, the phone lines are down, and that becomes a lot trickier. And I think, as you were saying, Saijai, you have to go back and consult other people. And this goes back to, I think, what Dr. Ken writes a lot about in his book is fact production. What you withhold as a human rights organization and what you don't withhold. Do you withhold the names of the person? Do you withhold the place? Do you withhold the age of the person? Do you withhold, like, how much information do you give away in the public realm? And I think those conversations we're having, I think, probably on a daily basis. Patrick. Yeah, over to you. Thank you.
I just want to comment. Hello. I just want to comment. Thank you all for the great job you're doing. It is very important and critical, but unfortunately, very few people are interested in this kind of stuff. But yeah, so we can talk about all the human rights violations and all that, but it's for the victims' families, right? Those are the crimes. If something happened to me and my family, it's not just a simple human rights violation. It's a crime against the families and the people who are impacted, right? And the last thing I want to talk about is we need to find the root cause of all these atrocities, right? There's some business behind it. They're trying to protect some of the interests. And so that's maybe we better go to the root cause and then solve the root cause will be better than going through one by one cases. Just my comments. Thank you.
Maybe we can discuss, that's a really interesting remark you had based on documenting individual cases or documenting structural processes, I think is what you're saying, going back to the root cause, trying to document the structural issues that underline the individual airstrikes or cases. I don't know if any of the panelists have any comments on that. Yeah, Saijai.
I think what you said reminded me of the Burmese proverb that when somebody throws a rock, it's not just looking at the rock, but finding the hand that throw the rock, right? So I think what you bring up is actually really important in terms of the change in the way that we're doing human rights work, because a lot of the work that people do, a lot of the work that we do is incident based, but in order to look into the person who threw the rock, it also require different collaboration between different human rights organizations to share the data and collaborate together. So for example, when we try to see the troop movement or the fire, the way the airstrike movement and the fire in Myanmar, it's really difficult to just use the data that we have, that we collect. And I feel that we could achieve the goal that you're saying by having more collaboration between different human rights organizations to share the data and collaborate. And right now, to be honest, I don't see that is happening. It's a lot. Of course, there are reasons in terms of data privacy that we talk about that we cannot share, but I do think that we could do more in our space to collaborate and share together and create a data file in the way that still protect the data privacy of the person. And that also trigger to the pipeline, which is the way the donor is funding, right? So I think the way that if donor is listening, I think like the way you fund all this human right work is really important to think about funding ecosystem instead of like funding organization. As I mentioned, we cannot do the work we do if we don't have people like Esther and Myanmar crime documentation to like go and document. We cannot do the work if there's no journalists, right? So instead of like putting a pile of money into like certain organization that publishing report, like we are one of them, focusing more on organization that doing great work and amazing work, that their work might not be reducing in the report, but because of the work, we can do the work we do. And yeah, so I think in order to achieve your goal, the way donor funding needs to change.
Great point. I would just comment in two ways. Human rights are divided into positive and negative categories. Civil and political rights, which have dominated the Western agenda of the global North, are rights to be free from torture, things the state should not do or be able to take away from you, like freedom of opinion, right to organize. Positive rights are like economic, social, and cultural rights. They are aspirations, things we want. And part of the problem is the human rights movement, and here I'll make a very big generalization, and certainly those in the legal field that operate in that arena, focus on civil and political liberties, and that matters. But by doing that, you all too rarely address the structural issues that are driving the conflicts in the first place. Economic drivers, in the case of Myanmar, are obvious. Cultural independence and freedom is a key driver of the conflicts in Myanmar, but it doesn't get the attention it deserves. The focus is on something else. And so if you are to talk about mass atrocity prevention, which is a topic that gets insufficient funding, insufficient research, insufficient programming, you need to take into account those rights and what can be done in advance before you get to the stage of mass atrocity or genocide. And the world is doing a dismal, dismal job of addressing that side of the conflict. So you are exactly right. Whether that is the job of Fortify Rights or not, I leave to Fortify Rights to decide. There's a time and place for all manner of things, but I can say there's not enough work being done on the prevention side.
Do you want to say no? No, I think it's a really important point, and I think where it becomes difficult is the reality of human rights advocacy, in that we are really, especially on Myanmar, we are working in a very crowded field where, especially these days, attentions are divided with Gaza and now Lebanon and Ukraine happening. Myanmar is falling more and more down the list of priorities for states. And I can directly attest to that over the past week, meeting with governments in Geneva. And so, when you have that kind of very divided attention and quite pessimistic outlook on the prospects of justice and accountability in Myanmar, it means that I think that the work that we present to states in particular has to be really focused, because otherwise they will just ignore us. And that's just, unfortunately, the reality. So if we started going in and talking about the socioeconomic foundations of what's happening in Myanmar, I think we'd lose the room automatically. Hopefully in the future there'll be room for that, but I'd just say at the moment the reality is that we need, as human rights organizations, states at least are expecting us to come with information about atrocities and just about atrocities, and very much a legal kind of approach to it. So that's where I think the challenge lies.
We have a question in the back.
Thanks to all the speakers. I found this event is very important and interesting for me because the event also highlight the most important part, in my opinion, is the collaboration in terms of archiving the information, not only among ourselves, the one who do the reporting, but also the families of the victims and also the most important person like Esther in here. These questions to Esther, please. Any specific knowledge or collaboration that you think the local journalists should be equipped with for helping you, like doing more, to be able to work with also the security of yourself and also the informant in the field. Thank you.
Yeah, the idea that the collaboration, yeah, what Saijai mentioned earlier, we really like that. We're trying to collaborate with other groups, other human rights groups as well. It is very important because only one group can do that much thing. If we combine, if we gather all the information we get and if we share each other, it will be a very good result for us. And in the field, there are a few. To be honest, there are few journalists working on the ground. For journalists, we collaborate each other. There are also some journalists and human rights activists like human rights group like Fortify Rights. They came and then came to the ground and investigate the incidents. As we are based on the ground, we help each other. What's happening on the ground? Which cases we have, and we always share that. And also for the security, we can maybe we can do that much thing. We can protect ourselves from airstrike, or we have some rules to obey, like not going to the place where landmine have or something like that. But what we can do is just helping each other, and yeah, and that we can do in the field. And for information, we would like to share all our information. We are happy to share our information, what we have, all to all the human rights groups, and also that we want to get some information from them too, so that we can make a bigger investigation. Yeah. Hello.
On time now, we have about 10 more minutes. So we have one final question that came in, which I think is might open up a can of worms, but I think I'll pose it to Dr. Ken first, and then we'll see how we go. We have about 10 minutes. It says, in Dr. Ken's book, it mentions there's truth and fact production in human rights investigations. What happens when there are discrepancies from different groups in the documentation process, I guess, like online maybe or offline? Yeah, so what happens when there's discrepancies in the documentation of different groups?
Thank you for that question. Please let them know. Well, it depends on the issue and the kind of discrepancies. For example, in some cases, they're to be expected and they're seen to be acceptable. So a good example are drone strikes in remote areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan after so-called, Taliban or insurgents. And you have several challenges. One is, how do you define an insurgent as opposed to a civilian? What is that definition? Where it happens, whether there's a first-person witness reporting back, whether there's corroborating reports, whether it's in just one news outlet and what their bias is, or multiple, and so on. So you're really trying to triangulate information and make an educated best guess. And anyone who understands the politics or the realities of drone strikes is going to know you're almost always talking about estimates. There are exceptions. That was a question that came up all the time in Gaza with the death toll from the health body on the Palestinian side. How are they counting? How are they verifying the bodies? How are they determining women and children versus men? How do they know if the man is Hamas or just a man who happened to be there? So in cases like that, quite obviously, it becomes incredibly politicized. And so you find huge differences and ranges in the number of killed and wounded in Gaza, depending on the source. And people tend to pick a source that supports their political position. Unfortunate but true, but everyone understands that, and that is the work you're doing. In other cases here, and I'm thinking of Myanmar, for example, it becomes really challenging when you have a well-known, well-resourced organization like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International reporting something, and maybe a local group that does not have the same name recognition, does not have the same credibility, but in fact may have the more accurate reporting. They don't have the same reputational value in the international marketplace. So there is a tendency, especially for lazy journalists, as Patrick said, to go with the well-known source, when in fact they may be very biased or just insufficient reporting to actually know what's going on. So part of the task of human rights reporters like Esther and other human rights groups is trying to determine who has the best, most accurate, most unbiased information and helping to amplify it. Because their work, Burma Crimes Investigation, for example, arguably knows the most on what is happening in Karenni State than any other group currently reporting. But they are not well known. So what can a group like Fortify or somebody else do to amplify their information so that more accurate, well-sourced, and timely information about what is happening can reach a broader audience, including policymakers and human rights lawyers? So this comes, I think, to your point earlier about collaboration. This may not be Fortify's mandate, but does it have an ethical responsibility to provide assistance to groups working for a shared goal? And that is an answer I do not have. That is an internal Fortify discussion. But I think there can be a lot more collaboration rather than competition to help show why the little guy, the unknown group, may in fact be the best, most accurate source you have. So that's my initial thought, and I'll pass the mic so everyone has a chance to speak if they so desire.
For me, I felt like the discrepancy, not just among the human rights group, but it's also between the human rights group and the bad actors. So there's many times that the incident happened. It's not just the disagreement between human rights group or what happened, but actually the actors also saying that this is disinformation, what we're reporting, right? So what you bring up is actually the thing that we face all the time. From the way of open source investigation, what I can tell is that what we do is point out the dot, but we not draw the line. That is the work we do. the person who draw the line is the person who reading report, and you can draw your own conclusion. So what we do, if, for example, there was an incident of the fire in Saijai, and the SSC said that they are not the one who like start this fire in the church, but however, everybody's saying that they are the one who doing it. So the work that we do at Myanmar Witness, what we do, we're not saying who doing that. What we produce is that we're producing, here is the location. This is the dot that we found based on the data. This is the location that we geolocate. This is, we can prove based on the firm data that there is a fire. We compare before and after. Yes, there's a fire at this point. We verify the time. This is the time of the fire that this fire happened. This is the image of the victim that were burned. So what we do is that we point out different dot of the story, and then it's your conclusion, you can draw the line. So we're trying not to create the line because that's the information that we don't have. What we could do best is sharing the dot.
Yeah, maybe I can just speak a little about how we approach these questions at Fortify. I think that we do feel like we do have an ethical responsibility to work with less well-resourced groups, to partner with them, to co-publish with them, but also to work behind the scenes. In the most case, that's what we're doing, providing technical hands-on support, whether it's English editing or communications or advocacy, and then also trainings and workshop. And it's a big part of what we do. So we are doing that, and we do think that we, as a group based here in the region, and working hand in hand with less well-resourced groups, we do feel like it's a responsibility, and it's an area that we want to expand even further into. And I think collaboration and a collective archive, for instance. I think on Myanmar, I think everyone's looking to the IIMM to be the collective archive, and that's great, and we fully support what that mechanism is doing. But at the same time, what do we get out of it? To put it bluntly, is there a way that we can have access to what other groups have submitted to the mechanism? I don't think so currently legally in the setup of the mechanism. And so then that leaves us in this situation where we are all working individually kind of in the dark. We are collaborating when we can, when there's opportunity, where it makes sense for donors and funding, and those kinds of issues do play a role, unfortunately. But maybe there's room for a collective archive outside of the IIMM process. In terms of the discrepancies, I haven't really had any first-hand experience of that, but what I have had first-hand experience of is where we've documented something that the community that we've documented it within is split on whether we should talk about it publicly. And that's been really interesting. The example that I specifically worked on is police cards in Mersat. So these are cards that are they're corrupt. It's a corrupt scheme by the Mersat police to give out these fake identity documents to refugees that they say will protect them from arrest. And I documented the use of these police cards and how they were working. And there were some people who were saying, yes, it's really wrong, and if we talk about it publicly, then maybe the system will change. And then there are other people who are saying, no, absolutely not. This is the only form of identity that we have, even though it's completely immoral and illegal and corrupt. It's all we have, and it's enabling our freedom of movement. And so it's still going on. So it's always a question about how much we bring it up. And I think going back to kind of the meat of the discussion today is that we do make choices when we are documenting, when we are talking about what we documented. And I think we, as a human rights group, are fairly unapologetic in that we are trying to create systemic change. And so then we do present what we document in a certain way to try and create that systemic change, to defend people who are vulnerable and who need our assistance in whatever, the people we're serving, essentially. And so, yeah, it does come with choices, and sometimes those are really difficult choices and ethical dilemmas that we struggle with on a daily basis.
And Esther, over to you for final remarks.
Yeah. Yeah, for the collaboration you mean, right?
A final question was around if you document facts that are different. So if one human rights group says that something happened in one area and then there's like a bit of different information, so discrepancies. How do you deal with discrepancies, diversity of information in your work?
Yeah, in our work, there's always been like these challenges. Sometimes when we ask one person, they told that their age is 28, and some people told that 27 is like a difference because Burmese people always think that when they are 27, they already 28. They have some kind of tricky. Yeah, it's so we need to ask more detailed question about that, and we need to also talk with other groups or other journalists who investigate, who work on that case. So we had to confirm again. Confirm with the source again, with the survivors again, and then we finally we will take that which is the most precise, the precise one. Yeah.
Thank you, Esther. That's a really good practical answers for us. I think we're just about out of time. I really want to thank the people that tuned in, the people that came this afternoon in person. It's very hot in Bangkok, so I really appreciate it. I also just want to give a big shout out to Dr. Ken. He is a senior advisor for Fortify Rights and has helped our organization over many years think about these questions privately, and it's great to discuss them more publicly with you. His book that came out not so long ago is called Crimes in Archival Form. You can order it online, and it's a really practical book about the different conversations that we're having today that goes into a lot more detail. So I would highly recommend it. And thank you again, Esther, Saijai, and Patrick for joining today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.